I was in a provincial archive cross-referencing municipal records for an unrelated project when I found the photograph. Black and white, late 19th century, judging by the emulsion quality. A statue unveiling. The monument depicted a man in period dress, early 1800s, perhaps earlier, holding what appeared to be drafting instruments. Classical pedestal, dignified pose. The attribution read simply, the architect. Not Architect Jones or in memory of Samuel Richardson, master builder. Just the architect. The caption offered no clarification. Municipal dedication ceremony. Nothing more. I should have moved on. I didn't. The deeper I looked, the more I found. Not scattered examples, not isolated oddities, a pattern that repeats with unsettling precision across dozens of cities, across multiple continents, across different administrative regions that supposedly had no coordination with one another. Monuments to the physician, the scholar, the engineer, the writer, the composer, anonymous tributes, nameless honours, statues erected at considerable expense, and these were expensive undertakings requiring committee approval, public funding, skilled artisans, dedicated to people who, according to every official record I could locate, never existed. The official explanation is simple, elegant even. These monuments, we're told, represent ideals rather than individuals. They're allegorical, symbolic tributes to professions, to abstract concepts of learning and civic contribution, the kind of neoclassical symbolism popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. Think of Lady Justice. Nobody asked for her birth certificate, and honestly, that explanation would work. It should work, except it doesn't account for the details. The monuments to concepts, actual allegorical statuary from the same period, look different. They're stylized, idealized, often female figures in classical dress representing commerce or liberty or justice. Their faces are generic, their clothing timeless, their poses theatrical. These other statues, the unnamed ones, they're portraits, specific faces, individual features, period-appropriate clothing that places them not in timeless allegory but in specific decades. One statue shows a man in what textile historians identify as 1790s fashion. Another depicts someone in garments consistent with the 1740s. These aren't abstract ideals, these are people. Real people wearing real clothes from real time periods, immortalized in bronze and stone, honored with public ceremony and civic resources, and then systematically stripped of their names, not their faces, not their professions, just their names. Here's where the official explanation collapses entirely. These monuments appear across an impossibly wide geographic range. I've documented them in city records from what we now call Eastern Europe, Western Europe, parts of Asia, scattered reports from the Americas, though many of those are harder to verify. Either the statues themselves are gone, or the records are suspiciously incomplete. The pattern is too consistent, the timing too synchronized. Throughout the mid to late 1800s, city after city, town after town, erected these monuments, not over centuries, over decades, sometimes within the same few years, different sculptors, different committees, different municipal governments, all independently deciding to honor the physician or the scholar with identical anonymity. The probability approaches zero. Let me be clear about what I'm describing here. This isn't like architectural styles spreading through cultural exchange. That happens organically, slowly, through trade routes and pattern books and traveling craftsmen. This is coordinated narrative, synchronized storytelling. Multiple cities, often with minimal contact, somehow all deciding simultaneously to commission expensive public monuments, dedicate them to unnamed individuals, dress those individuals in period-specific historical clothing, honor them with identical generic titles, provide no biographical information whatsoever, maintain this convention across decades, all without proper documentation of why, and all while pretending this was normal. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me describe what I found when I categorized these monuments by profession. The architect appears most frequently. Dozens of documented examples, possibly more, that have been destroyed or misidentified, always male, always shown with drafting tools or architectural plans, often positioned near significant buildings that themselves have questionable attribution in official records. The physician, the scholar, the engineer, the writer, the composer. These professions repeat, not randomly, not with the variation you'd expect if different cities were independently choosing symbolic figures, the same roles, the same poses, the same generic titles. And then there are the outliers, the ones that don't fit the pattern quite as neatly. The navigator, found in what are now landlocked regions, the cartographer, in places where official history insists no significant mapping occurred. The chronicler. That's a peculiar choice, isn't it? Why would cities in the 1880s honour anonymous historians, unless there were histories that needed to be reconsidered, rewritten, attributed elsewhere? The pattern repeats, but it also reveals. Each profession suggests not just what was being honoured, but what was being erased. Not all of these monuments survived. Some disappeared in the early 20th century. Wars, urban renewal, shifting political winds, all plausible explanations. Except the pattern of which ones were destroyed is suspicious. The monuments that survive tend to be the more abstract ones. The writer holding a quill, the physician with period-appropriate medical instruments, vague enough to be reinterpreted as purely symbolic. The ones that disappeared, those were more specific, more detailed. I found references in old city records to monuments that included additional elements, maps showing territorial boundaries that don't match official histories, astronomical instruments calibrated to observations that weren't supposed to happen yet, architectural elements that reference building techniques attributed to later periods. Those are gone now. Archival whispers hint at something similar with statues. A 1920s council minute mentions removal of the monument per directive. No explanation, no elaboration. It had stood for 47 years, then it didn't. Another fragment. A statue, formerly known as something else, rededicated, recarved. The maps it held replaced with different objects. New plaque, new narrative, not destroyed, repurposed, which might actually be more revealing. If these were merely allegorical symbols, why the need to change them? Why go to the expense of physical alteration? Unless the allegory itself had become problematic, unless what was being symbolized could no longer be publicly acknowledged. I've examined dozens of these monuments' inscriptions. What they don't say is as important as what they do. Standard monument practice, even for purely symbolic statues, includes dates. Erected 1885, in the year of our Lord 1877. Something to anchor the monument itself in time. These, many have no dates at all, or they have dates that create problems. A statue of the engineer dedicated in 1889, but the figure's clothing and tools date to approximately 1750 to 1780. Why commemorate a 19th century ideal of engineering by depicting someone from a century earlier? The standard explanation, that the sculptor was simply depicting period costume for aesthetic reasons, crumbles under scrutiny. Some of these statues show technological details that were supposedly not in use during the period the clothing represents. Instruments, tools, specific types of measurement devices. The evidence suggests something much larger. These monuments were created to preserve specific individuals while simultaneously erasing their identities. Not to honour the abstract concept of architecture, but to acknowledge a particular architect, while ensuring that architect could never be researched, verified, or connected to specific buildings and accomplishments, preservation through anonymity, memory through forgetting. Let me tell you about the gaps. Municipal archives from the 19th century are usually comprehensive, exhaustively, tediously comprehensive. Permits for street vendors, records of minor property disputes, pages and pages documenting the mundane machinery of civic life. But around these monuments, gaps, missing committee minutes, lost correspondence, damaged by water or destroyed in fire, or simply whereabouts unknown. always the documents that would explain the decision-making process, always the records that might contain names, biographical details, justifications. The sculptor contracts survive, the expense reports survive, the dedication ceremony programs survive, the explanations don't. I've spoken with archivists, quietly, carefully, about these gaps. Most haven't noticed the pattern. Why would they? Each gap taken individually is unremarkable. Archives have gaps, documents get damaged, lost, misfiled. But when I describe the specific pattern, documents related to these specific monuments across multiple archives in multiple countries, some of them pause. One archivist, older, near retirement, looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know, I always wondered about that." Then she changed the subject. She wondered, but she didn't investigate. Nobody investigated. Here's something I couldn't ignore. Some of these monuments are sculpted in styles that predate their official creation dates by decades. Not slightly outdated, dramatically so. Statues from the late 19th century, according to municipal records, executed in sculptural styles consistent with 1820s neoclassicism. Not a revival, not an homage. The actual technique, the actual approach, as if the sculptor learned their trade 70 years earlier. How? One possible explanation: the statues themselves are older than their official unveiling dates. They were created earlier, stored and then installed later with manufactured provenance. Another explanation: the sculptors were working from much older models or sketches, reproducing existing monuments that needed to be replaced, updated with new or rather no names. Either way, we're back to the same implication. These monuments are preserving something older than their official histories suggest, and that's where the whole edifice of symbolic allegory becomes impossible to ignore for what it is: a cover story. Map these monuments and you see something else, something the official explanation can't accommodate. They cluster, not around capitals, not around major cultural centres, though some appear there too. They cluster around specific types of cities. Trading hubs that existed along routes that official histories say were minor or insignificant. Port cities that supposedly weren't major ports during the period the monuments commemorate. University towns where the university's official founding dates postdate the periods depicted in the statues' clothing and instruments. The monuments mark something, not abstract ideals, places, specific locations where specific people did specific things that can no longer be officially acknowledged. The navigator in a landlocked region. Perhaps it wasn't always landlocked, or perhaps the routes being navigated weren't waterways. The cartographer in a provincial town. Perhaps that town was more significant than current maps suggest. The pattern suggests a network, a web of connected places, connected professions, connected knowledge, all systematically disconnected from official history. I mentioned earlier that some monuments were destroyed. Let me be more specific about what I found. There are photographs, not many, but enough to establish pattern. 1920s and 1930s primarily. Images of demolition crews, statues being removed from pedestals, loaded onto wagons, hauled away, in some cases actively being broken apart. What's notable is the care taken in other demolitions of the period. When genuinely historically significant monuments were removed for urban renewal, there are records, discussions about preservation, debates about relocating rather than destroying. Museums acquired pieces, private collectors purchased fragments. For these unnamed monuments, nothing. They were removed and they disappeared. No museums interested in the architect, no collectors seeking the physician. Just gone. Let's address what I haven't found. No debunking campaigns. No official explanations published to counter alternative theories. No government statements clarifying the purpose of these monuments. Silence. When other historical oddities or conspiracy theories emerge, there are responses. Academic papers explaining the conventional understanding. Museum exhibits addressing misconceptions. official histories being defended or clarified. For these monuments, nothing. Ask a local historian about the architect statue in their city's main square, and you'll get a shrug. Oh, that old thing. It's just decorative, I think, symbolic of civic pride or something. Ask why it's dressed in 1780s clothing when erected in 1890, and you'll get another shrug. Artistic choice, probably. Ask why there are dozens of nearly identical monuments across multiple continents, and you'll get puzzled looks, because most local historians don't know about the others. They know their statue. They've never considered the pattern. The silence isn't conspiratorial, it's ambient, structural, the kind of not knowing that doesn't require active suppression because everyone has already agreed, without discussion, not to ask. The chronology matters. These monuments appear most frequently between 1870 to 1895. A concentrated burst of monument building across multiple continents, all following the same pattern, all honouring the same anonymous professions. Then they stop. Not gradually, abruptly. After 1895, I can find almost no examples of new unnamed professional monuments being erected. The practice simply ends. Cities continue building monuments to named individuals, to military victories, to specific historical events, but the anonymous tributes cease. Why? What changed in the mid-1890s that made these monuments unnecessary, or impossible, or too dangerous? One possibility, whatever was being preserved, had been sufficiently erased from official history that the monuments themselves became redundant, or too obvious. Another possibility, the generation that understood what these monuments represented was dying. Their children, raised on the new official histories, wouldn't recognize the significance. The monuments would become genuinely symbolic, genuinely anonymous, their original purpose lost to time. Perhaps that was the point. Create the monuments while memory still lived. Honor the unnamed while people still remembered the names. Then wait. Wait for memory to fade. Wait for the official history to fully replace the remembered one. Wait until the architect becomes just the architect. A symbol, an ideal, a decoration. Wait until no one asks anymore. I think about knowledge, not abstract knowledge, specific knowledge, technical knowledge, the kind embedded in the hands of practitioners, in the methods of craftsmen, in the approaches of thinkers who don't leave written treatises. In surviving photographs of certain statues, figures hold instruments that don't quite make sense. Period-appropriate surveying equipment, yes, but configured in ways experts can't fully identify. Maps showing projections slightly off from standard methods, or slightly right in ways that shouldn't have been accessible yet. Astronomical instruments that resemble astrolabes but with additional elements, modifications, purposes unknown. What did they know? What were they measuring? What were they calculating? We can't ask them. We don't even know their names, but someone thought their knowledge important enough to honour publicly. Someone thought their contribution significant enough to immortalize in bronze and stone. And then someone else thought their identities dangerous enough to erase systematically. Both things can be true. I've avoided the obvious question. Let me address it now. Why would anyone want to erase these figures while simultaneously preserving their monuments? The official narrative, that these are purely symbolic, requires us to believe an impossible coordination. But the alternative, that something was deliberately hidden, requires us to ask, hidden from whom and why? One framework. These monuments preserve memory of a recent past that contradicted a newly established historical narrative. The figures couldn't be named because their documented achievements, their verified existence, would create inconsistencies in whatever new official history was being promoted. But their contributions couldn't be completely erased without notice. Too many people still remembered, too many buildings still stood that bore their influence, too many technological advances couldn't be explained without acknowledging their work. Solution: preserve the honour while erasing the identity. Create monuments that acknowledge contribution without attribution. Let the names fade while the vague memory of achievement remains. Within 1 or 2 generations, the disconnect would be complete. Future historians would see the architect and assume symbolism. The actual architect, their name, their biography, their specific buildings, would be lost. All that would remain is stone and bronze and a vague sense that someone sometime did something worth remembering, just not worth naming. I stand sometimes in city squares looking up at these anonymous faces, bronze oxidizing green, stone weathering smooth, features that once represented specific individuals now softening into abstraction through time and rain. Tourists walk past without looking, pigeons roost on their shoulders, city planners discuss removing them to make room for modern sculpture. They're just decorations now. That's what we've been told, that's what we believe. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm looking at ghosts, not metaphorical ghosts, actual preserved impressions of people who existed, who contributed, who mattered enough for cities across continents to honour them publicly. People whose names we'll never know, whose achievements we can't verify, whose very existence has been rendered debatable. The monuments remain, the people are gone. And the gap between those two facts is where the mystery lives. I don't know what was erased. I don't know why it was erased. I don't know who decided that the architect could be honoured but not named, preserved but not remembered, acknowledged but never researched. I only know that it happened, systematically, deliberately. Recently enough that photographs exist, but long enough ago that memory has faded. And I know that when I ask about these monuments, when I point out the patterns, the timing, the coordination, the gaps in records, the stylistic anachronisms, the distribution that suggests network rather than coincidence, I'm met with that same ambient silence, not hostility, not denial, just disinterest. As if the questions don't matter. As if some part of us already knows that certain things aren't meant to be examined too closely. Many of the statues are simply gone or destroyed, but some stand. They'll probably stand for decades more, maybe centuries, silent witnesses to something we've agreed without discussion to forget. And perhaps that was the point all along, not to hide the past completely, but to render it unexaminable, present but unreachable, visible but incomprehensible, to turn history into decoration, to turn people into symbols, to turn names into silence. Mission accomplished, but the stone faces remain, watching, waiting, unnamed, but not quite forgotten, not yet.